welcome to the next video in a series about the fundamental pillars of no-code, and in this video we'll be introducing a new pillar, which is APIs and integrations. In other words, a whole new world of integrating with different service providers, different third parties, and using their full offerings and their data to power your own no-code app. Now, if you haven't already, I strongly advise that you pause this video and go watch our database pillar, and you also watch our workflows pillar, because the knowledge that you've got there is going to really help apply and get the best out of APIs and integrations. If you've been following along chronologically, you'll already have done that, so stay tuned and we'll dive into this subject. Now, APIs and integrations are a little bit technical. They have varying levels of difficulty depending on what you're trying to do, but we're going to keep it really simple. And I think the really important thing to remember here is this section might feel tricky, but this is the key to unlocking the power of the internet, to really leveling up what your app can do. And I think by the time you get to the end of this video, you're going to have a completely different outlook on app building, and you're going to just realize how much power APIs can add to what you can already do in a no-code tool. So if that sounds exciting, let's dive in and find out what I'm talking about. So let's start with a bit of an introduction to APIs and integrations. So for me, an API really is a building block of the internet. A lot of no-code tools out there essentially exist to let people stitch together several APIs and use that to create the software they need in a nice, bore-apt user interface. And so an API is essentially a way for two computers to communicate, and when they successfully communicate, we call the outcome of that an integration. I'll get into that and what that really means in a little bit. Let's look at some of the kind of high level details first. So first of all, an API stands for Application Programming Interface. Now that is just a fancy way of saying a language that two computers can speak in. We'll stick to the phrase API and integration because frankly that's a mouthful. Now, the best way to think about an API is a little bit like taking a pipe from a third-party company or service and connecting that into your app, and then being able to send data and services both ways. It's just really a way that companies make available for you to get anything that they offer. Obviously stuff that they want you to be able to get. It's not a way to steal data from companies, it's a way to access the data that these companies want you to access. For example, you might use Facebook, and they might allow you to access all of your friend data or all of your Facebook photos or something like that. Similarly, you may have an API into Microsoft Outlook, Office 365, Google Calendar, something like that, and you might be able to send all your calendar appointments to them and receive all your calendar information from them. So it's really just a pipe, and an API is essentially a common language. That means rather than you having to understand, how does Google Calendar work, how does Facebook work, how does whatever third-party service work, there's just this really set universal way of talking about it. It's a little bit like speaking, to somebody in a different country. Both of you have a different native language, but perhaps you use English or a different common language between each other to communicate. That's kind of how it works. Quite often you're going to hear the phrase REST, a REST API. REST sounds a bit like kind of sleeping, that sort of rest. It's got a long complicated name. Representational state transfer. That sounds very complex and technical, so we'll leave that alone. But essentially what it means is once you understand how REST kind of looks and feels, you're essentially going to be able to use every single API out there. And by the end of this, you're going to know exactly how REST looks and feels. So almost every internet company you can think of out there has APIs. I can almost guarantee that if you're looking to get information about something or do something, the chances are a tool already exists out there to do it. And if you look over the last 10 years, there's a few things that have made software entrepreneurship much easier than it was in, say, 2010. Clearly, there's been things like the rise of no-code. There's been the rise of cloud computing that mean you no longer have to spend a ton of money in data centers, etc. But one of the most important and underlooked real advances of the last 10 years has been the proliferation of APIs. Back in 2012, 2013, not that many companies had an API, but now they're ubiquitous. You'll find them everywhere. And as somebody who's trying to build a no-code app really quickly, make use of no-code tools, this is great news for you. So quite often APIs will be available for free, more often than not. Occasionally you will have to pay for an API, but a really great example of an API, and I might have mentioned this before, is sign in with Facebook. You've probably seen it before. You go on a website, there's an option to sign in with Google, with Facebook, etc. Essentially what's happening if you do that is your users entering their details into your app. Your app is checking with Facebook, Google, whoever else the provider may be, to see if that set of authentication details, email, password, whatever else is correct. And if it is, they're coming back, they're telling you it's A-OK, you're allowed to let them into your app. So that's just an example of an API. Now, in terms of this phrase integration, if I mentioned earlier that an API is like a pipe between to an app and some other company, some other server. That's probably not strictly true. An API is a language that allows the pipe to be created. Once that pipe is in place and you essentially are connected into another company, Facebook, Google, whoever it might be, and you're able to transfer data between yourself, your app and them, that is what we would call an integration. That means you're tightly interconnected, you're integrated, and you're ready to start working together. And so the really interesting thing is we use that phrase to describe what many no-code tools already have. So there's tons of popular different APIs out there. For example, a really exciting one is one called Twilio. Twilio is a company that just let you send text messages, SMS messages, by sending an API request, and we'll talk about how you do that in a minute. But many no-code tools have that built in as a default. So rather than you having to worry about how it works, you would just sign up for that third-party company, Twilio, and then your average no-code tool is just going to let you put in, essentially just log into that and then start sending text messages however you like. So instead of you having to worry about how that API connects and what that common language is, quite often these are just integrated in by default. So we already have that pipeline there. We call that an integration. But in the same vein, if you end up manually finding an API, connecting that yourself, as you probably will, that's also an integration. You've made that connection, you've made that integration. So let's talk a bit more about what an API actually is, because I'm aware this is all quite abstract at the minute. How does it actually work? So an API primarily works by a request and response system. In other words, you send a request to an API-specific web address and it comes back, it sends a response with the information that you requested. And as I've written in the slide here, I know this is quite a packed slide, but the best way to think about it is it's really just like a phone call. You phone somebody, you ask a question, they give you an answer, you hang up. And so it really is just that system of send information, receive information back. Quite often there's going to be a lot more complexity to that. You've got to send 5 things and get 5 things back, etc. But at its real base level, you're just simply asking requesting something from an API and getting it back. Now, typically an API request is going to contain 2 things. So it's going to contain what we call an auth token, sometimes called an API key, and I've got an example of that on the right. And it's going to collect it's going to contain a set of data called parameters. These are typically in the key value pair format that we've seen in data types, that we've seen in workflows, etc. And they just let you specify exactly which data you want. We'll come back to them in a minute. But quite often when you ask an API for data, and you can kind of do 2 things. You can send information to an API and have it save it. For example, you might have an API to let you upload a photo to Flickr.com or to Facebook. And so if you were to use that API, you would be sending a photo in your request, and the only information you would be getting back is a yes, we've uploaded that, or no, we haven't, for whatever reason. And so when you ask an API to do something, most typically you are asking it to tell you about some data, to tell you something, and so we'll quite often call that querying an API. If you've not heard the word querying before, it just means asking a question essentially. So you're querying an API, you're asking a question of that API. So let's talk a little bit about that auth token just before we move on. Most services that have an API, let's take Twilio from earlier, you will sign up to them. Somewhere in your settings or your profile, you'll have what's called an API token, an API key. It'll look like a big long, random bunch of numbers and text like I've got in that picture. And you'll then take that and you will plug that into some sort of a little box or whatever, depending on your no-code tool, and that's just going to essentially works like a username and password does on the normal internet. You've got that token, that means you can prove who you are, it's good to go. This one in particular is for a company called Webflow. You've probably seen it already if you've spent much time in NoCode.Tech. This is not my API key, this is just a generic image from the internet, so if you want to control NoCode.Tech, I'm afraid that won't work. But one tip actually just worth pointing out there is once you generate an API key, never ever ever share it with anybody. Make sure it never becomes public knowledge, because if I have your API key, I can control whatever I like on your account. It really is that easy. So let's move on a little bit. All sounds great. How do you actually use an API? Well, there's three key ways. I think I held up 4 fingers there. 3 key ways. And the first is that you can manually make a request. Now, there are a bunch of different tools out there. We tend to call them API clients. Most of them are not very friendly to a non-technical person, but they exist. And they essentially just, every API is made up of the web address where the API is. It's just like a website. It'll usually be something like api.facebook.com/ photo API, something like that. So you can usually put that address in, put your authentication token in, put your parameters in, which we'll discuss in a minute, and send off a request. Thankfully, most no-code tools have an API client built in, and because they're aimed at non-technical people, it's usually a little bit less technical. So typically you can make an API call directly from your no-code tool. So one thing you won't struggle with is being able to make those manually. It really is built in left, right and centre. And if it's not, you can use a service like Zapier or something like that, which come with a kind of free range manual, do your own API request built in from the start. We'll talk about Zapier a bit more in a minute. So the next thing you can do is you can use a direct integration. Again, just like I discussed on the last slide, many popular APIs like Twilio, which is for SMS, OAuth, which is for signing with Facebook, signing with Google, etc., stands for Open Authentication. SendGrid, which is for sending email, Stripe, which is for taking payments. These are all really, really popular APIs, and it's very hard now to find a no-code tool that doesn't have them built in from scratch. All you really have to do is add your API key in and go straight from there. And then lastly, I've mentioned this tool a couple of times, but you can use these integrator/connector services, whatever you want to call them. Zapier is probably the most prominent. Integromat is a close second. There's also a few others like NoCode API, which is pictured, NAN, and probably others as well. Parabola's one. And essentially these tools just kind of build the API integrations for you. So you go in, all these integrations are pre-made, you pick the ones you use, you kind of glue them together a little bit like a workflow from our previous pillar, and then typically you can trigger them from a no-code tool as well. It is also very rare to find a no-code tool which isn't integrated with Zapier and Integromat, so usually you can start from there as well and just kind of connect things as you need it. So at this point we kind of understand what an API is, what an integration is, how you kind of use it. I know you don't actually know how to use it yet, we'll come to that later on, but let's just kind of crack on. Now, there's one thing to say. We've talked a lot about how an API lets you access data, but an API is not direct access to a database. It's not like you authenticate with Facebook or Google and then you're instantly able to go see the photos table, the users table, etc. Essentially a workflow sits in the middle. So what's really happening is when you call an API, when you make an API request, you are essentially triggering a workflow on that company's side. That workflow will typically take your request, validate if it is secure, allowed, it's okay to respond. It will check what you're looking for. So maybe you've said, I'm trying to download the Twitter user Niall's tweets and I want to know what they all are. So it will validate that. It will then typically either take the action that you want to take, maybe jump into the database, get the data. It will then package that up and it will send it back to you in a nice, easily formatted package. Typically that package will be a key value pair, so you get a bunch of keys back. So for example, I just gave this idea there of a photos table on Facebook. So imagine I had an API for getting whatever photo I wanted off of Facebook. you can imagine it would probably come back with a key that says the photo name, and then each value in that key value pair is probably going to be a link to each photo that I can go and download the photo and do whatever I want with it in my own app. So in other words, you're only going to see what the owner of an API wants you to see, and I really wanted to touch on that because I think if you're new to the concept of APIs, you're kind of going, why would any company let me just get into their database and take whatever I want? I could be anybody. That's not really the case. It's a lot more controlled. And it's a lot more kind of nuanced and checked than that. And conversely, if you want to make your own API, you can entirely control what data is and isn't accessible by API. And to be honest, in this day and age, for a mildly successful no-code app or no-code software business, it's going to be hard to not have an API for something, maybe integrating with a partner company or something like that. So let's talk a little bit about parameters. This is probably the most important part of the API. If you've already looked at our UX and UI lesson, and you probably won't have by now, but if you already looked at that, we have this concept of repeating data lists, which is just a list of data, and then for that list of data you can filter it. So you can say, show me everybody from my users table who has a Gmail account or who has been a member of my no-code app for more than 30 days. You can really just filter it to get whatever criteria you like, in the same way that you go to Google and say, show me restaurants which have Mediterranean food nearby me. Parameters are just a way to filter an API. So if I went to, let's say, this imaginary Facebook Photos API that I've come up with, then I don't think it is imaginary, by the way. I do think it exists. But if I was to go to that, then I could say, show me photos from the API, and then the parameters that I would put in would be something like photos which are less than 3 months old, which come from this user, I don't know, Niall123, and which are below a certain size of image, say 1,000 pixels by 1,000 pixels. You can just specify random stuff like that, and clearly I'm making that up on the hoof. But another example I was going to give was just our orders database from earlier, and how we sort of had this idea of t-shirt e-commerce store. If you've been following along, you've probably heard me explain this about 5 times now, but this idea of a t-shirt e-commerce store, we've got a customers table, we've got an orders table, we've got an inventory table, they're all connected together, and so when you place an order, it goes into the orders table, ties that to the customer who placed the order, and it ties that to the inventory or the stock, which is a part of the order. So say we had that, and we had an API that we built on top of that. Essentially what we could do is we could let that API allow anybody who's got an auth token that we've created and given to them. We could let anybody, see what orders we have, maybe take action, mark it as fulfilled, something like that. We can maybe let them create an order, but we could also choose, like maybe we don't want them to see a customer's address, so we could hide that and say, okay, well, you can see the date of the order, you can see the items, but you can't see maybe who bought it, or you can't see their address or their payment information. So you can completely dictate what people can see, and equally other companies whose data you want to use or access with an API will completely dictate what you can see as well. I gave an example here of a restaurant because I kind of think that's the best way to think about it. If we think about an API call being like a phone call, you phone, you make a request, you get a response. Imagine phoning a restaurant to book a table. Now you're going to phone and you're going to say, I want a table, and you're going to get some sort of response, but you want to put parameters in there. You want to say, well, I want to book a table for 9 p.m. and I want to book that on the 17th of March, and I want to book that for 3 people. So those pieces of criteria around about how you want to book your table, those are what we would call in API terms parameters. And so the person picking up the phone at the restaurant on the other end of the line is going to say, okay, I've got your parameters, I'm going to check, and then they're going to come back to you with a response, which is either, yes, you can have your table and here's the details, or no, you can't, please try again. And if they say, please try again, you'll say, oh, okay, what about the 18th of March at 9 p.m, with 3-4 people, whatever it is. That's kind of how this works. And so when you're doing that, from a no-code tool point of view, then it's going to look a little bit like this screenshot here. You might have seen this before. I've referenced it in another video, and it's just this idea of key values. If this was a restaurant, the key would be time, the value would be 9 p.m, the key would be, date I want the table. It would be 17th of March. It would be, the next key would be number of people. The value would be 4. So you could send that and you could get that back and just really get an answer. That's what an API call could look like. And if you're struggling to come up with a business idea, there you go, a booking API for restaurants. So again, parameters, they can be incredibly complex. They can be really simple and just ask a few things, or they can ask 1,001 things. It really depends on the service or API that you're accessing. And I'm going to have a demo video just after this as part of this series where I'll make a request and I'll sort of show you how that looks and how that works. So a bit of a note on that then. Every API out there has what we call documentation. In other words, it has a user manual. Most pieces of documentation look the same. We've kind of, in the same way that APIs are a common language, as developers and programmers, we've kind of come up with a fairly common way of describing APIs as well. The downside for you is, as a visual developer, as a no-code or as a non-technical person today, documentation is not the easiest thing in the world to read, but once you know some of the patterns, you can pick it up pretty quickly. So I'm going to do another video where I talk you through just how to read documentation and how to make sense of it. So this is kind of one thing to remember. Why do you need documentation if it's a common language? Well, the reason is, as much as it's a common language, clearly parameters aren't universal. The information I need to give a restaurant API, for example, my table time, number of people, etc., is going to be very different to what I might need to give, let's say, an API for buying milk, because I'm going to have to tell that, well, I want it delivered on this day, I want this amount of milk, etc. Or let's say I've got an API for booking a taxi, okay, I want a taxi at this location, I've got to give the address, I've got to give, etc., etc. So, clearly parameters are very different for every API, and if you were making your own API, then you would pick your own parameters. So that is always different across every API, and as a result, you always have to go and look at the documentation to not only make sure that the API will give you all of the data that you want, because it won't give you every bit of data they have, and number two, to make sure that you understand how to get it, you understand the parameters, etc. Beyond that, how the parameters work, how the API is accessed, all tends to be very, very similar. And when I do the follow-up demo video after this around about making an actual request, and looking at documentation as well, you'll quickly kind of see what I mean and why that makes sense. So we're going to talk about a couple of things then as well, just to kind of bring out that commonality. And this is where APIs tend to get a little bit more abstract. So this is where you really need to pay attention. So typically, an API can do two things usually. It can give you data. So it can read it, it can update it, it can work with data, can add new things to the database, can take them away, etc. Or it can perform some sort of a service. So when you think about it, signing in with Facebook isn't changing a database really, is it? It's just, it's a service. It's saying, yeah, you can sign in, or no, you can't. And so, although APIs can do that, we've been trying to stick to this idea of a common language. And so even if you're doing a service like that, maybe if you're taking a payment, Stripe, for example, which is a payment API, if that is taking a payment, it still revolves around this idea of thinking of it like a piece of data. So what you would actually do, for example, if you were going to take a payment, you would kind of expect that you send the card details and it comes back and says, yep, we've taken the payment with those card details. Actually, what happens technically is Stripe will take your payment details and it will save it to a new record in a database that will be called something like payments. And it will say, okay, this payment was taken by, Niall or whatever your name is. It's for this no-code app with this API token, and the payment was taken on this day at this time for this amount of money with this card. So it will save all the details. And then all Stripe will do is come back to you with that database record. Stripe has a workflow that says, when I save a new database record, for example, a new payment receipt, take that and do something with that. But all that you ever see is the data that you give Stripe, which is payment, card details, customer, etc. And then Stripe will come back and say, yep, we've got the payment. I'll confirm back the details. So we did it with this card, we did it with this amount of money, we did it at this time and day, and I can confirm the transaction is processed. And so that maybe sounds a little bit obvious, but it's just this idea of an API, in terms of the language and the way it works, it is about sending data back and forward, but even if it's a service, it is about sending data as well. You know, with our Facebook example, Facebook is just going to come back to you and say something like, here's the customer's details, so, or sorry, here's the user's details. So, yep, this is their email. We can confirm that. They're authenticated with Facebook, and the password was correct. So it's always going to come back. It's always going to go back and forth in the form of data. And so as a result, when you access an API, we think about this term called resource. A resource is just a fancy name for a database table. It literally means the exact same thing, so you can think of it like that. So a Facebook API or a Facebook database is going to have a friends table or a friends resource, you know, a post table or a post resource, a photos, you know, so on and so forth. And it tends to treat every table as an individual kind of API, and all those APIs are part of the bigger API, which is the Facebook API. So they're all little individual parts you can think of individually. You don't have to use all of them. So, you know, with Airbnb, I'm going to expect to go through an API to be able to see apartments and stays. You know, for Facebook, I expect to be able to see my friends list, my photos. For Amazon, product suppliers, departments. But I'm going to think of all of them as a database that I can ask questions of and see information of. In the same way that when I, for example, use a variable and I specify, okay, I want this particular bit of data from this particular table in my database. That's kind of the way to think about APIs as well. You're specifically saying, okay, I can kind of see from your API documentation how your database works. Now I want this information, that information, and this information. And of course, the API will dictate whether or not you can have that information. But that's kind of how it works. So it all revolves around about this resource. And we talked a little bit earlier about when you're going to use an API, you have a web address like api.facebook.com, and so what that web address is actually going to look like is going to depend on the database table you are accessing. So you might have something like api.facebook.com / photos, and then you might have /nio123, and that's going to give you the specific record for me, for my username. Equally, I might just have api.com, api.facebook.com /friends /nio1234, and that's going to show everybody who's friends with the user nio1234. Now, exactly what that address looks like and how that works is what you're going to find in the documentation, but that's the general kind of idea. You know, it's all based around this idea of data. You make your request based on the data, you send a bunch of data, you get a bunch of data back. It's really as simple as that. And you'll be surprised, by the way, about how many complex interactions can simply be turned into a series of data types. Did the user do this? Yes, no. Did this happen? Yes, no. So that's just kind of the way to think about it. In terms of API operations then, because we're really thinking about it as data, and because we're trying to create this common language, then typically when you make an API request, you have to give it an operation to perform. The operations are get, and get essentially lets you just read the data. So if I want to go to the Facebook API and read all and find out all the friends that nio1234 has, then I will send a get request. So I will say I'm requesting that I get that data and I read it all. Next, if I wanted to add a new friend onto nio1234's profile by sending an API request, then I would do what's called a post request. I'm posting some data up to Facebook, and what that's going to do is create a new record in the friends database, for example. And if I want to, let's say I've got a friend on there already and I want to change the status of that friend, maybe I want to unfriend them, maybe I want to change some sort of detail, then I can send a put request, essentially, which just updates it. And if I want to delete something, then I can send a delete request, nice and easy one to remember. Now, if you're reading all that, that might look a little bit familiar, because what I have just described is the CRUD methodology. And when I said during the CRUD methodology lesson, if you've seen that, when I said during that CRUD essentially powers most of the modern web, it's the way most people think about things, APIs are the reason for that. That is the case because CRUD is essentially this default language for APIs. Now, you're not going to be able to use necessarily every different, get, post, put, delete. You're not going to be able to use every operation on every API. Quite a lot of them are simply limited to get for reading data and post for updating or changing data. And why have they got different names? Again, programmers just are all very different people and like to give different names to different things. From our perspective, we're just going to treat get as read, post as create, put as update, and delete as delete. So might sound a little bit weird to get your head around, but it'll make a lot of sense really quickly. And in the same way that you can quickly map out what an app can do with CRUD, you're quickly going to be able to make sense of APIs, because APIs are just mapping out a CRUD essentially on top of the database tables that they expose. So actually, when you put them both together, instead of being confusing, I personally think it gets really, really easy, because you start to see a lot of the similarities between the two kind of API operations and CRUD. So I do admit it is starting to get pretty complex. I can imagine at this point you're going, this is a lot more technical than I planned. And thankfully, I've taken the time to try and explain the real intricacies of how this works. But thankfully, you're not going to have to do it that much because of tools like Zapier. Now we're going to talk about Zapier. There's some alternatives, but let's kind of dive in and find out how you use APIs without actually using APIs directly. So we have this tool called Zapier, and if you think of APIs as almost code, then Zapier is really just a no-code version of APIs. It's a drag and drop interface. It's got tons of different API connections on it, thousands, and you can literally just pick the steps and drag and drop them both together. Now, I've got a little screenshot on the right here that shows all of the different kind of integrations they've got built in, and that really just drives home what Zapier actually is. It really is just a visual platform for connecting integrations together rather than having to do it manually via API calls, etc. And so you're going to find all sorts in there. Literally, I couldn't name them all, so it's probably worth just going on and having a little search and a bit of a look around yourself. But you're going to find Google Calendar, Webflow, Airtable, Typeform, QuickBooks, Facebook. You've got Instagram, Asana, so on and so forth. I could sit here and list them probably literally all day. And actually, if you don't find what you're looking for on Zapier, you'll probably find it on other places like Integromat, NAN, etc. And you'll be surprised at what you can find. I was looking for an API for for Etsy the other day. There was nothing on Zapier, but it had something on Integromat. So it's always worth checking all of them out. But it truly is an absolutely wonderful tool. It is used by almost every no-coder out there. So really is one worth taking a look at. And just to kind of talk to you a little bit about how it actually works. So if you remember our when we talked about workflows, we talked about this concept of triggers and actions. Usually in software, something happens which causes something else to happen, which is also, a bit like real life. And, Zapier, being nice and easy and simple, causes triggers and actions. So every time that you look at a new integration or a new API or a new app on Zapier, it'll have a list of different triggers. So for example, for Google Calendar, you're going to have triggers like when a new calendar invite comes in, when a calendar information is changed, so on and so forth. So it's going to list all of them, and then simply you're going to have another side, different actions, create a calendar event, update a calendar event, etc. And so you can tie things together. I could say when a new calendar comes into Gmail, into Google Calendar, use SendGrid or use Gmail or use Microsoft Outlook or some sort of email service to send me a notification of that. So you can take triggers from one API or one application, glue them together. But you can actually do a lot more than that. You can combine loads of them. We've got tons of different integrations through Zapier that power the NoCode.Tech website. So for example, when you sign up, it will do things like it will notify us when we've got a payment. It will save your details to our database. It will send you like a welcome kind of onboarding email. So there's all sorts of stuff that can just happen, and you can, if you look at that little example on the right, there are 3 different tools immediately visible in that. I think we're adding a 4th one in here as the GIF goes along. So there's all sorts of different stuff you can do and chain together. And as I mentioned right at the start, quite often the key to no code is integrating all the right services in Zapier, and then using something like Webflow, a Dalo card, some sort of no-code tool to put a visual front end on top of that and just make it all work nice and seamlessly. And don't be afraid to do that. You don't need to build this stuff from scratch. If Zapier can do it, then absolutely give it a try. But it's just essentially that idea, when something happens, do something else. That's what it boils down to. It's just, as much as it's an external way of building integrations, it's also kind of just an external workflow builder as well. So just a few wee facts here, just stuff that's interesting to know. Zap facts. First of all, Zapier is supported in pretty much every single no-code tool out there. Any tool that you're using to build an app in this day and age, it is very unlikely it doesn't have Zapier. It will almost definitely have Zapier built in. And if you somehow find a tool that doesn't, maybe because it's just really new, they've not got around to it yet, you can just kick off a Zap by making an API call, and almost every no-code tool will support an API call if not Zapier. So you could just have a Zapier set up, which the trigger is receiving an API call, and then use your no-code tool to do that, to create your integration. You can also use Zapier for the same reason for most API tasks that you'll need without ever having to touch code. Because you've got that manual API tool built into Zapier, you can use Zapier itself for creating API calls and essentially working with any API you like. But it also has every kind of reputable API built in, so you're very unlikely again to come across a situation where there's a popular API you want to use that isn't available in Zapier. With more kind of like niche partners, smaller companies, absolutely you might find that. And one thing to bear in mind, if there's a company you're interested in working with and they don't have a Zapier integration, ask them if they do have it, because Zapier has a ton of hidden integrations that aren't live, aren't accessible, etc., aren't approved, and therefore you can often go ask a company if they've got one available and use it from there. And of course, if you really can't find it, then you can just use Zapier's API tools manually kind of out of the box. So as I kind of said, it is essentially a way to build workflows with, you can use it for your own data and logic. You can build other API tools into it. If the no-code tool you're using doesn't have great support for workflows, Zapier can kind of take care of all that for you. It's not the cheapest tool. It certainly is kind of fairly expensive to use, but you kind of have to bear in mind that a lot of no-code tools are pretty expensive, and that can be quite prohibitive for people. But generally this stuff is going to be a lot cheaper than paying a developer to do it. In fact, that 100% is, the kind of things that Zapier can do for £10-20 a month is going to be much cheaper than getting a developer to build something out. And depending on your own circumstances, potentially cheaper than, spending a week working on it yourself, or a couple of weeks, or whatever it might be. Now that's all I'm going to say about Zapier for now. We do have a really in-depth introduction to Zapier tutorial series, and we've got a ton of different videos across the site about Zapier and how to use it. So if you're looking for something, it'll almost certainly be on there, and if not, just give us a shout and we'll try to help you out. Now, there's a couple of other little bits and pieces with APIs I just want to talk about to wrap up this video. There's another kind of type of API that you need to know about called a webhook. And if you think about an API request as being a call out, a webhook is kind of like you waiting for somebody to phone you. The best way to think about it is, imagine you gave somebody your phone number, which in this case would be your webhook address, and you told them to phone you whenever they get some kind of information. Well, that's what a webhook does. It's a way for you to listen to receive data about something. And for example, if you were using Stripe, then typically Stripe will let your accountancy software know that you've received a payment by using a webhook. At the same time, if you were a supplier who was selling their products on Amazon and you had a sale through Amazon, then you would find out that you had a product sale to kind of fulfill, because Amazon will happily send some sort of webhook API call to a webhook that calls into your software and tells you, okay, clearly I've got that order, it's time to go ahead and fulfill an order or do whatever an action is built off of your software. So if you need somebody to be able to programmatically send you API information, then a webhook is absolutely how you would do it. And it really is just an API that is round the other way. You know, it's back to front in that sense, and it will just work the same way of kind of how you put an API together. You know, you tell the person who's going to be calling your webhook, you tell them what parameters you want, you tell them what data they can access, you make sure they have whatever, you know, API authentication token you want them to have, and that will kind of deal with it. And usually what you'll do is you'll set up some sort of workflow so that when your webhook comes in, a workflow will trigger off, it will start happening, and that will just make your API work and tick over. Now, I mentioned at the end of that video, I'm going to put another video just after this one that kind of just gives you an example of a webhook and how it works. A few different tools we can use for that. Zapier, for example, primarily works on webhooks, so we'll possibly look at that as well. So really just kind of one last thing here to bear in mind about APIs as well. This isn't going to be a problem for most people watching this, but there are a lot of people, for example, who will use an API for gathering a lot of data. You know, let's say you were building an app for finding investors, and you wanted to access a bunch of investor data. You might go to some sort of company that provides that as an API, as a service. You know, they've maybe got a couple of million investors in their database and they make that available to you. If you're having to consume a lot of data, either a big amount of data or you're having to consume it in real time, then quite often you're going to hit up against the rate limit of an API. In other words, you might be having to make requests to that API too many times in 1 minute or 10 minutes or whatever their own rate limit is. And as a result, they're going to block you from using the service for a temporary period of time. It completely depends on every single API out there. They all do it very differently, but a very common one is, you know, typically you can't make some number of requests, you know, more than every minute, 60, 40, 100, something like that. It really depends. But if you're going to be having to call an API a lot, for example, because it is real time, just make sure you check that in your documentation. And occasionally, if you've got a valuable use case or it's worth doing, if you speak to the API provider, they quite often can turn that rate limit off for you, or at least make some sort of adjustments or exceptions. And then just, you know, we kind of talked a little bit about this in terms of in webhooks, but just around about making your API, your own API. If you have to do this, again, the reason would probably be because either you've got some data that you want to make available to others, maybe you've got people that you want to partner with. A lot of no-code tools will let you do this out of the box. Some of them you might have to do it through a service like Zapier. And then occasionally what you might want to do is use a no-code tool that is really well equipped for the job, and then have some sort of shared database, perhaps an Airtable, between your app building tool and your API building tool. Now, one of the tools I really like is Xano. There's a few others out there like Backendless that are pretty good at this as well. But Xano is just a great tool for building an API, because it immediately, whenever you create your database in Xano, it just immediately and automatically creates all the get, post, put, you know, delete APIs for your users to kind of, you know, just automatically get into and use, and then you can start to kind of tweak parameters, etc. as you go. So it can just be a really good way of trying that out, and I'm going to put an example video at that of the end as well. And then, you know, again, if you're going to create your own API, essentially just use the CRUD methodology. Take all the database, all the data tables that you want to show. Think about it in terms of CRUD. You know, how do I want this to fit together? Create, read, update, delete. Think about it like that. Draw that out, and then just assign the proper API calls to it, like post, get, etc. If you do that, probably within 10-15 minutes, you can quickly design a pretty decent API. So, as I've kind of said, I'm going to put up some further viewing. We're going to do a video on reading API documentation. We're going to do a video on how you actually use APIs, so making a request, and we'll do a video on webhooks. I do think it's worth also checking out a video on Zapier, but we've got plenty across the website that I'll link to down below as well, so don't worry too much about a unique video on that. Thank you very much.